right. Well, thank you, Michelle, for the opportunity to share the word. And thank you, everybody, for those awesome prayers and manifestations. It's always a joy to hear those. And it's such an act of love to pray publicly and openly and to bring forth words from our Father. So thank you for that. If you guys have been tuning into the Sunday earlier fellowships, I've taught a couple times recently from the Psalms, and it all started with a gift that was given to me by Dave and Carol DeMars, which is a book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It's by Philip Keller. He's a pretty prolific writer, and he was a shepherd for a number of years in his life. And it's just such a beautiful little book. It's a fairly quick read. But it got me thinking about how important the Psalms are and how little I really understood or retained about the Psalms. And I've done the 1 year Bible thing several times over and have really enjoyed that, but especially the format that has a chunk of the Old Testament, chunk of the New Testament, a chunk of Psalms and a chunk of Proverbs. I always found it pretty distracting to make all those shifts. And Proverbs and Psalms were the ones that I would skip or speed read. So when I got that book from the DeMars, and I read it actually through a couple of times, I thought, I think this is my time to spend time in the Psalms. So I started in Psalm 1, and I'm now about Psalm 88. And I'm reading them just a couple a day and rereading them many times over. To really let them sink in and to understand why this huge book of Psalms was put in the canon, and why God spoke it to faithful people who would record them. So there's a little bit of, if you have tuned into those prior fellowships, there's a little bit of redundancy here. I hope not too much. And Michelle, I'm not going to share my screen. I did email Dave the document, but he has several email programs and I don't know which one to look at. So we just won't take the time to do that. But I want you to know that I have a document that I'm going to send Michelle, and she can distribute it to any of you who want it. That is the first points that I'm going to make in this sharing. So as I have been reading the Psalms, I've been recording things that I wanted to kind of get my arms around. What is it that the Psalms offer us? What is it that they present? And I'm going to go through my list, which I know is not a complete list by any stretch. In fact, I added one this morning during the other fellowship. But anyway, so what do the Psalms provide for us? Wonderful examples of how to pray. Psalm 5 is a great example of that. We're not going to go there because I've taught it in prior teachings. The Psalms provide wonderful examples of how to praise. There are dozens and dozens of Psalms that illustrate this. Psalm 47 is a really wonderful one. The Psalms give us vivid pictures of our human condition in contrast to God's power to deliver. I used to think of it in terms of, and you may have heard this phrase, God's viewpoint versus our viewpoint. And I really have been reconsidering that phrase as I've been reading through the Psalms, because our viewpoint is not against God's viewpoint. It's just a different perspective. So I started to say, well, then how do we say that? Maybe our experience and God's truth, or man's lament in contrast to God's power to deliver. And many of the Psalms are laments, and we're going to read one of those this morning, but Psalm 12, Psalm 18 are both vivid pictures of man's perspective and God's perspective. The Psalms give us pictures of God's faithfulness to deliver us. Psalm 23 is a great example of that. The Psalms give us guidance for godly behavior. And Psalm 15 is a beautiful example of that. The Psalms express the reliability of Yahweh's words. Psalm 19, and of course, Psalm 119 are examples of that. The Psalms express the certainty of our hope, and the Psalms being written primarily to the Jews, to Israel, to them that would be the knowledge of a resurrection, that we wouldn't always be in the grave. And we'll see some of that today too. But Psalm 30 and Psalm 85, where we're going to close this morning, are great examples of pictures of our hope that's painted in the Psalms. And then this next point may be a little bit challenging to get your arms around, but similar to the book of Proverbs, which express ideals, Psalms express sentiments and reflections, albeit still written by revelation, God's pure words, still true, but are not always our necessarily guaranteed outcome in this life. And that in this life is an important qualifier. And I'm just going to read for you Psalm 18, verse 3 says, I will call on Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised, and I will be saved from my enemies. And when I was in Psalm 18 was about the same time that I heard about the Nigerians, Christians who were rounded up and slaughtered. And I really struggled. I really struggled reading that verse and, cried out to the Father, what is up with that? Because I'm sure they were praying too. I'm sure they knew this Psalm. And I called my brother and we talked it through. We cried together and just talked it through and came up with, a couple different points that I think are important to consider when you're reading the Psalms. One is that the Psalms are written from a present perspective, but often what's talked about is referring to something that's going to occur in the future. We know that we will absolutely be saved from our enemies by the rapture and by the that we won't go through the tribulation if our eschatology is correct, which I think it is. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have that kind of an outcome for us currently. Now, in Psalm 18 is one of David's Psalms. So another thing that my brother and I talked about and thought about was, prior to Christ, there were a lot of interventions by God with a view toward preservation of the Christ line. Now, that's not to say that God doesn't still intervene. Read the book of Acts, right? Read the epistles, understand Paul's life. It's not to say that God doesn't currently intervene, but we think, John and I, as we discussed it, realized that there may have been a difference in the interventions prior to Christ, and the intensity, the frequency, whatever. however you want to say that. But anyway, just a couple of points to keep in mind about understanding that the Psalms are reflections and express sentiment. And the point that I added this morning, and this will be on the document that I send Michelle, the Psalms teach us in a very vivid way that to have distress or fatigue or discouragement is not sin. But if you allow the distress and the discouragement and your fatigue to get you to quit, then that's sin. So we know that God is faithful. So we keep on keeping on with that knowledge. So anyway, where I want to go is Psalm 71. We'll start there this morning. And I picked Psalm 71 for a couple of reasons. One is that I read it recently. And two is that it really encompasses several of those bullet points, that things that the Psalms present. In Psalm 71 is an example of how to pray, how to praise, what we hope for, God's power to deliver. So a whole bunch of those bullet points are in this Psalm. So we'll just start in verse 1 and read it. And it starts out with a prayer. In you, O Yahweh, I have sought refuge. Let me never be put to shame. That's a prayer request. Deliver me in your righteousness and rescue me. Incline your ear to me and save me. Become for me a rock of refuge to which I may continually go. You have given the command to deliver, for you are my cliff and my stronghold. And something to keep in mind, I've been making notes about certain recurring words or phrases in the Psalms. Rock, fortress, shield, deliverer, and here we see stronghold, are all words that occur over and over and over again in the Psalms. And they are wonderful, concrete images. We all know what a rock is. We know what a shield is, not necessarily because we've used them, but because we understand war and history and all that kind of thing. So just something to keep in mind as we read through. Oh God, in verse 4, deliver me from the hand of the wicked person, from the grip of the wrongdoer and the ruthless person. And then in verse 5, he starts kind of an answer to his own prayer, an expression of wonderful hope and God's power to deliver. For you are my hope, O Lord Yahweh, my confidence from my youth. And I love that. Why are we confident in God? We're confident because our hope is sure. We're confident because he's faithful to uphold his promises. We heard that in manifestations today. Tom's beautiful interpretation of tongues. You made your promises and we believe them. I loved that. And then in Donna's prophecy, you show up and I'll show up. It's just wonderful thoughts. In verse 6, I've been supported from you from my birth. You are he who cut my navel cord from my mother's womb. My song of praise will be continually about you. I have become an omen to many, but you are my strong refuge. My mouth will be filled with your praise, with your splendor all the day long. Do not cast me off in my old age. Again, prayer, do not forsake me when my strength fails. And then I guess he continues kind of in prayer. For my enemies talk about me. Yes, those who keep watch for my soul have consulted together, saying God has forsaken him. Pursue and seize him, for there is no one to deliver him. So the psalmist is recognizing he's in danger. He's recognizing that he is sought by people who would like to see him put to shame or put to death even. Oh God, verse 12, do not be far from me. Oh my God, come quickly to help me. Let the adversaries of my soul be put to shame and be consumed. Let those who seek my injury be wrapped in reproach and dishonor. But in verse 14, I will continually hope and will praise you yet more and more. My mouth will announce your righteousness, your deliverance all the day long, though I do not know its full extent. And this is beautiful because these next several verses in this psalm kind of shift from prayer and calling to God out of a pretty desperate situation, understanding that his hope is sure, to kind of our response, or the psalmist's response to those truths and those realities, and a beautiful expression of, well, okay, well, what are you going to do with it? I'm going to shout about it. So in verse 15, my mouth will announce your righteousness, your deliverance all day long, though I do not know its full extent. I will come with the mighty works of the Lord Yahweh. I will make your righteousness known, yours alone. Oh God, you have taught me from my youth, and I still declare your wondrous works. Yes, even when I'm old and advanced in age, oh God, do not forsake me until I have declared your strength to the next generation, your might to everyone who is to come. And this is our job as well, right? We have the ministry of reconciliation, and what does that mean? But communicating our joy in God's deliverance, our hope that we have for our day and time, that we can shout about it, that we can declare that unashamedly. Verse 19, yes, your righteousness, O God, reaches to the heights of heaven. You have done great things. O God, who is like you? You have shown us great distresses and evil things. You will return. You will revive us. You will bring me up again from the depths of the earth. And there's a beautiful expression of understanding the resurrection that this psalmist absolutely knew, that he was not going to be in the grave forever. He also knew that he was going to go to the grave. There was not an understanding in Israel of that when you die, you go immediately to heaven. And that's very plain in the Psalms. This one in this verse right here, and then it's over and over and over again that it comes out that the Jews clearly understood that the grave, what came next was the resurrection. And that Sheol, which shows up in the Psalms over and over, is the state of being dead. It's the state of being dead in the earth. And they knew that. Then verse 21, increase my greatness and return comfort to me. Yes, I will praise you with the harp, praising your faithfulness, oh my God. I make music to you with the lyre, O Holy One of Israel. My lips will shout for joy when I make music to you. Yes, my soul that you have ransomed. And we've been ransomed too. And, the psalmist, of course, not having the same certainty of salvation that we have in our Lord Jesus Christ, but absolutely knew that by his faith, he would be ultimately resurrected in the resurrection of the just, the good one. Yea, my tongue will proclaim your righteousness all the day long, because those who have sought my injury have been put to shame and humiliated. And we know too, that's another point that where it's even written in past tense, it could, is very well going to be fulfilled in the future. And in many cases in the Old Testament and the experience of the early church and currently, that it's true in, it's a reality in life today as it is. We'll leap forward. So anyway, that one I really like because there's so much in there: prayer, praise, hope, resurrection, and what our response should be to our salvation. Hey, Ed. Okay, jump forward just a couple to Psalm 74. And this one I love because it's a wonderful example of a deeply felt lament about the psalmist, who was Asaph in this case, about his present condition. So it starts out, where are you? Kind of a, where are you, God? Sort of a question. Oh God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? And we feel like that sometimes, that if we're in a state where we're not getting our prayers answered, we're in a difficult situation, we can't seem to find our way out of it, it feels like we're going to be there forever. And so the psalmist expresses that. Why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoke? Remember your congregation that you purchased of old, that you have redeemed to the tribe of your inheritance, Mount Zion, where you have resided. Pick up your feet toward the perpetual ruins. An enemy has damaged everything in the sanctuary. Your adversaries have roared in the midst of your meeting place. They've set up their own standards. So the honesty of this is such a blessing to me. There are times when you feel like you just want to, remind God that, hey, I'm down here. I'm your sheep. I'm on your team. Where are you? Why do I feel like my prayers aren't being answered? Or why do I feel distant from you? And the psalmist is writing about the destruction of the temple, from his heart. Why everything's a mess, everything's in ruin. In verse 6, they've now smashed all of the temple's engraved wall panels with hatchet and hammers. They set your sanctuary on fire. They have polluted the dwelling place and of your name, bringing it to the ground. And then he goes on and on and on. I love verse 11. Why do you draw back your hand, even your right hand? Take it out of your pocket and consume them. I mean, I just love the honesty of that. And this is a prayer, right? I mean, I think about Jeremiah, when he told God, I want to sue you. I want to talk to you about your justice, because he just didn't see it in fruition in his life. So that I just love the honesty of that. And I think, well, I certainly can admit there are times when I have, felt exactly like that. I mean, currently, even how long is the stuff gonna go on that's going on? It just feels like the onslaught of mandates and government overreaches and things that feel like coercion. We're not used to that in America, and it doesn't feel good. And I've prayed to God many times during these months. Where you're laughing, Jeshurun, right? How far is it going to go, Lord? How far is it really going to go? And then in verse 12, he comes back kind of full circle. And so many of the Psalms are like this, where they start out with a really deep, heartfelt lament and sense of desperation or even despair. But then the psalmist comes around to, yet in verse 12, God is my King of old. working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. You gave him his food to people and desert souls. You opened up the spring and stream. You dried the mighty rivers. Today is yours. The day is yours. The night is yours. Also, you have prepared the light and the sun. And I think what's going on here in this recitation of God's beautiful works is the psalmist reminding himself and calling to remembrance all of the great things that God has done. And when we do that, there's a shift, right? There's a shift away from the sense of loneliness and despair toward comfort, toward the presence of God, toward the understanding that look what he's done in the past. He is still with us. You show up and I'll show up. That's what he said in manifestations. I just absolutely love it. And then skip down to verse 18. Remember this, that the enemy has mocked you, O Yahweh. Foolish people have blasphemed your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to wild beasts. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Honor your covenant, for the haunts of violence fill the dark places of the earth. Do not let the oppressed return to shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, O God, plead your own cause. Remember how the foolish man mocks you all the day long, and don't forget the voice of your adversaries. The tumult of those who rise up against you ascends continually. So again, an expression of lament, a remembrance of the wonderful works that God has done, and that he is indeed a faithful God. I just love the picture that it paints. And I wanted to what these songs echo for me is some aspects of a book that I read recently called A Heavenly Man. And I want to talk about this guy, Brother Jung. How many of you have read this by any chance? Has anybody read it? Jeshurun has read it. Okay. This book, it's an autobiography of Brother Yun, who was a missionary in China. He was a child during the cultural revolution in China when communism really, swept the country of China. And he felt a calling. His mother was a Christian, and he felt a calling on his life from his childhood. And this is the kind of book that I was so sad when it was over. I felt like a friendship ended or something, not that he died. I believe he's still living. He after several imprisonments in China and one imprisonment in Burma, Myanmar, and countless arrests, beatings, tortures, all of this kind of stuff, he finally did escape from China and settled in Germany and became a German. He was granted refuge by the German government and became a German citizen. And he has been, in the years following that, traveled all around the world. But he was largely responsible for the explosive growth of what are called house churches in China. And one of the points that he brings out in his book is that the Chinese government finally came around to the idea, after trying to crush the growth of Christianity and the spread of Christianity by tortures and beatings and all of that, the Chinese government started to allow a form of Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. But it was so watered down and pathetic and compromised that Brother Jung, refused to participate in that, and was offered that in exchange for years and years of torture and imprisonment. And he opted for the latter rather than compromise his faith. The reason he's called the Heavenly Man is one of his first arrests prior to being thrown in prison is he had traveled outside of his province because he felt the Lord had called him to go to this certain place and get some house churches started. And he got arrested there, and the guards, the people who were beating him and trying to get him to make confessions of his crimes against the state and all of this, and also to inform them of where these other house churches were. He pretended to be very confused, and they were asking him over and over between beatings, where are you from? Where are you from? And he shouted out, I'm a heavenly man. I'm not from this earth. And it stuck. And when he was imprisoned and the other prisoners heard that, then they nicknamed him the Heavenly Man. And so that's why the title of the book. But it really helped me through this dilemma of, like why really bad stuff can happen to us. And he handles it in his book so beautifully. And, in all of his imprisonment, he was horribly tortured, abused, starved, all this stuff. And he, how did he reconcile that with God being a God of deliverance? Was that he decided if he was in prison, there must be people there who need to be saved. And every prison that he was in, he won souls. And in the last prison that he was in, which was in Burma, he didn't speak the language. All of the prisoners in this, except a small handful in this prison, were Burmese, or Myanmaran, I guess you would call them now. And he didn't have any means to witness them, so he started singing. Of course, he's singing in Chinese, and he was singing the word hallelujah over. That was all the lyric of he used song a lot, and he would just compose them, as he was they would just come to him. But this one song, he just kept singing the word hallelujah, and pretty soon all the prisoners in his cell, which were over 100 of the cell, he didn't say that, but they all started singing in Chinese, in the word in Chinese, because that's what they heard him say, the same one word over and over and over again. And during that imprisonment too, he became very sick, and there was a hospital in the prison, so he was sent there, and he had heard that there were Chinese prisoners in this same prison. And the only way they could visit him or have any contact with him was when he was in the hospital, they would be allowed to go. And so they came and visited him in the hospital, and he witnessed to them, and they had fellowship in his hospital room. But as soon as he would be back in his cell, he would be back with all the Burmese people, and he would not see the Chinese people again. And every time they tried to release him from the hospital, he'd spike a fever or develop a cough or something, some setback would just pop up, and they wouldn't be able to release him from the hospital. So these Chinese brand new believers got to come and see him again and again and again. And that kind of typifies what his imprisonment was. And his last imprisonment in China, which was his like third overall or second overall. He was told by God, by Jesus, that he could escape that day. A certain day he would be able to escape. And he also had a vision of his wife telling him, you can escape now. It's time to go. And his wife he didn't know where she was. She was in China, but he didn't know specifically. She might have been arrested too. They had broken both of his legs in the midst of all the beatings and tortures. So everywhere he went, he had to be carried. And he witnessed to the people that carried him, of course. So something happened that day that a prisoner was let into his cell, and the guard got distracted and he walked out. And he had like 4 more sets of iron doors to walk through. And each time he got to one, something weird happened like that he was able to just walk through it. And finally he walked out into a courtyard, and there's a couple dozen guards standing around the courtyard with guns, and he just kept walking miraculously because his legs were healed. And he kept thinking every step, like, I'm going to get a bullet in the back of the head any second. And he just walked right past all these guards. And then the last set of gates, the ones that went onto the street, opened in front of them. It's just like Peter in Acts 12. We read that earlier this morning. And waiting outside those gates was a taxi. He got in, and he knew of a house church in proximity to the prison, and that's where the taxi guy took him. He ran in. He had no money, of course. He had nothing. He ran into the house and got money and ran back out and paid the taxi driver. So that, and then eventually from there he did get out of China. But anyway, so I obviously highly recommend this book. I found it life-changing. So anyway, we'll close in Psalm 85. And I love this one because it paints such a peaceful picture of the millennial kingdom. So it starts out in verse 1, "O Yahweh, you have taken pleasure in your land. You have restored the fortunes of Jacob. You have forgiven the iniquity of your people. You have covered all their sin, Salah. You have withdrawn all your anger. You have turned away from your burning anger. Restore us, O God of our salvation, and break off your anger with us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger from generation to generation? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your covenant faithfulness, O Yahweh, yes, grant unto us your deliverance." I want to speak for just a minute about this covenant faithfulness, the idea of covenant faithfulness, because if you read this psalm and many others that have this phrase in the REV, if you read them in other translations, you're going to find words like mercy, goodness, forgiveness, faithfulness, and so on, grace, words like that. So, this appears in Psalm 23. So when I was reading Psalm 23, that closes with, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life." And the REV translated, "Surely goodness and your covenant faithfulness." And it just was such an attention getter for me. I thought, what is that? Why did they pick that? Covenant faithfulness. So I did some study about the Hebrew word that the John and those who are translating the REV chose to translate covenant faithfulness is the Hebrew word chesed, and it's a common word in the Old Testament. It's in there over 250 times. 116 of those are in Psalms. So why the choice? Covenant faithfulness. And as I read about it, they chose covenant faithfulness because it sort of encompasses all of the wonderful qualities of what God is for his people. He's faithful, he's gracious, he's kind, he's merciful, he's loyal. And the idea of the covenant comes, it's rooted in that chesed, that Hebrew word. But the idea that God made a covenant with his people that he absolutely will not and cannot break. And wrapped up in that, then coming from that are all of the qualities of God that we understand and experience: mercy, grace, all of that. And when you look at the word as it appears throughout the Old Testament, it doesn't always refer to God and his covenant to his people. It's people that make covenants with each other. It was Israel's covenant to God, which they broke. It's individuals making a covenant with each other. The book of Ruth is a great example of that. Ruth's covenant faithfulness to Naomi, Boaz's covenant faithfulness to Ruth. So it's not a word that applies only to God, but it wraps up the obligations of those who make the covenant on both sides. So that kind of gives you an idea. For me, it really helped understanding why they picked that phrase, because it seemed distant to me at first, until I really got my arms around it. So that was verse 7, show us your covenant faithfulness. And then down in verse 10, covenant faithfulness and truth. And I love this, have met together. You know, again, the manifestations that we heard, you made your promises and we believe them. You show up and I'll show up. Love it. Covenant faithfulness and truth have met together. And I believe that this is these verses, these closing verses of this psalm are a reference to the millennial kingdom, because God's covenant faithfulness and truth haven't met together yet on earth in strong evidence anyway. I mean, as far as everyone, you know, can observe and see.
Already, but not yet.
Yeah, Dave says already, but not yet. And verse 9, surely his deliverance is near those who fear him, that glory may dwell in our land. And that glory is definitely a reference to the future kingdom for Israel. So covenant faithfulness and truth have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. What a wonderful expression of a pairing of righteousness and peace. And again, I really believe that this is a future thing, fulfillment. Truth springs out of the earth. Righteousness has looked down from heaven. Yea, Yahweh will give what is good, and our land will yield its produce, which we know in the millennial kingdom that the fruit of the land is going to be ever so abundant and available to all the people in it. Righteousness will walk before him and prepares the road for his steps. And that certainly is, I guess, you could say in a way that we're in that preparing the road phase of things. So anyway, I love that psalm because it's such a beautiful picture of what we can look forward to for our future. So that is what I wanted to share, what reflections or comments